Hi. Hi. Welcome to our fourth and final Crime Pays lecture series. This talk will be entitled Native Invasive in the Ecology of Biogeography. Hey, had you gone for a minute, didn't I? Our Crime Pays lecture series, asshole. All right, well, today we're going to be talking about. You got a reverb in this room? Is it pretty bad? The acoustics of this room, I should have hung some sheets on the walls or something. Just getting that sound wave bouncing thing. It doesn't sound too nice. Today we're going to be talking about. Let me make sure this fucking thing is recording. We just get turned up. Why is he so angry? Okay, today we're going to be talking about native, invasive. The idea of a continental ecosystem, of a lineage being restricted to a certain continent due to barriers like oceans, the biggest barrier of them all. And then we're going to be talking about the whole concept of invasiveness, invasion biology, which a lot of people, no one I'm friends with, thank God, still don't get. I really get the reality of it. It's really hard for us as humans to zoom out and get a decent picture. I understand it. The whole native thing took me a while to wrap my head around, 10 or 15 years ago, whenever it was, and I only wrapped my head around it because I was planting shit illegally around my city and realized that the native shit did the best and didn't require as much irrigation because it was already adapted to a summer dry climate, the Mediterranean climate, as they get in the Bay Area down there in California, actually the whole California coast. So anyway, we're going to start off talking about these trees, American chestnuts. A lot of people probably know about these. You can see them smiling honky. Well, they're not really smiling honkies. I don't know if they don't look like the smiling type. They look like the posing in front of large things they're about to kill type. It seems to be a common theme among certain demographics. But anyway, you could see these lumberjacks with their tights and their fuck me boots and everything, and they're standing in front of these large trees. These are American chestnut trees, Castanea dentata, in the oak family, Fagaceae. And on the right, you got the whole distribution of these trees up there. What is that? Basically, northern Mississippi, up through, a little bit in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, a very tiny bit in southern Illinois, going through Appalachia, basically the whole Appalachian Mountains. Even on up the end to Maine, for all those retards that live in Maine. No offense to them. So this was a huge tree. It was a large component of these ecosystems. It was everywhere. You could see big, beautiful trees, very big and girthy. A nice package, all right? Kind of like David Bowie in the Labrynth, when he was wearing those tights. If I do say so myself, he had a nice. Anyway, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. But these. This is a very important tree. Okay, very ecologically important. One out of every four trees, it's said, in some of these forests was an American chestnut. And unlike oaks, which have mast years, acorn, you get a shit ton of acorns every couple of years, but it's not a reliable thing. They have oaks tend to have mast years. You get maybe a handful of acorns every now and then, but every few years they'll get a mast year, and that's not to be an adaptation to these boom and bust cycles of many of the rodents, like them damn squirrels that would prey on the acorns. So a way around that, if you're an oak, is to have produce a shit ton of seeds one year and then hold off a couple of years, let those rodent populations crash again, and then do another mast year, and then, half those seeds will get established anyway. Chestnuts didn't need to do that because they got those spiky burrs, those spiky bulls that the seeds are ensconced in that protect the seeds. So I presume that's why they didn't do the mast year thing. But the point is, every year these things were putting out nuts, and they were just probably very important to a lot of the soil mycorrhizae because they are in Fagaceae, so they're probably ectomycorrhizal, as many oaks are. Just massively important trees. Insect pollinated flowers too, not wind pollinated like oaks, all right, which is nothing a lot of people don't realize about chestnuts, as well as Notholithocarpus, the tan bark oaks over there. I grew a couple chestnut trees outside of my house in Oakland, my dirty little punk house in Oakland, and I noticed the flowers, not only did they kind of smell like jizz, but they'd be covered in flies and all kinds of cool bees and shit. So very important ecologically that way. They fed in flowering and they fed the life around them in the form of their seeds too. But now they're gone. What happened to them? This guy right here, this Cryphonectria parasitica, an invasive fungus from Europe. Actually, it wasn't from Europe, it was from Asia. I don't know why it says Europe in there. It kills 99% of American chestnut trees. It's an ascomycete, so these are the fruiting bodies. They can reproduce asexually and then reproduce sexually as well. So here's the little. I guess is that the ascocarp looks like? I don't know. That's crazy. Anyway, this is when it's in fruit, right? And they like warmth and humidity to fruit, and they infect the tissue of the chestnut tree and then just start girdling it, essentially just killing it. Drinking a nice warm batch of matcha now. This is I tell you, this is fucking chilly in West Texas today. Okay, and there's what it does to American chestnuts. So American chestnuts are functionally extinct, and on the right you can see what's happening. It's just the whole tree dies, and then they can resprout from the roots. Thank God. If they couldn't resprout from the roots, they'd really be pretty much extinct. There's chestnut canker. That's what it looks like. This is what happens on Castanea dentata. There's a beautiful old Castanea dentata in Tumwater, Washington, just south of Olympia, in this cemetery. I was able to get one or two seeds off these when I visited. I think this was 2017. Look at that beautiful giant sequoia in the background. That's nice. But most of the squirrels got most of the seeds. And over here is Castanea mollissima, Chinese chestnut, which is relatively unaffected by chestnut blight. You can see, it looks all right. It's not that impressive. It's certainly not getting as big as those American chestnuts. It's Castanea dentata. It's supposedly the nuts don't taste as good. And it's just not that impressive of a tree in terms of stature. You don't get that straight, tall lumber either. Kind of more spreading, more diminutive. But Chinese chestnut is resistant to chestnut blight. It's a minor pathogen in habitat. These two things evolved together. There's the range of Chinese chestnut, basically, eastern China. All right, kind of similar climate to eastern North America, but yeah, it's just much different cast of species over there. There's a lot of disjunctions between eastern China and eastern North America. A lot of similar genera, but different species, Liriodendron, etc. It's a very interesting case of biogeographical disjunctions, como se dice nice. Presumably, they were just going up at high latitudes, and that's why the distribution is so widespread. And presumably, a lot of those genera, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, existed in Western North America too, but as Western North America dried out, they were just left in the southeast. So that was something Asa Gray, speaking of old honkies, it was something that guy Asa Gray was really interested in, that old botanist. Disjunctions between Eastern Asia and Eastern North America. Anyway, I digress. Let's get to the point. So according to research, the Chinese chestnut and American chestnut diverged in the phylogeny approximately 10 to 13 million years ago. How do we know this? Molecular clock dating, all right? Looking at DNA, comparing the sequences, the same sequence between two different species, or better yet, series of sequences, or hopefully at some point soon, entire genomes. Looking at the mutations that occur, like you can see here, sequence 2 on the bottom, that cytosine has turned into a guanine, and this thymine has turned into an adenosine. Am I pronouncing those right? Maybe I fucked those up. Who cares? Anyway, the C turned to a G, and a T turned to an A, etc. And so, based on these rate at which these base pairs flip, and how much it happens, and you can calibrate it with the fossil record, and based on a calibrated rate of change, you can kind of get an idea, just using simple math, simple arithmetic, on how recently these two species shared a common ancestor, based on the rate of change. Okay, so key points about this divergence. Studies using phylogenetic trees have estimated this divergence between Castanea mollissima and dentata based on genetic comparisons to be roughly between 10 and 13 million years ago. The geographic separation between East Asia and North America likely played a major role in their evolutionary divergence. All right, molecular clock hypothesis, again, going off on a little tangent here. Originally proposed by researchers Emil Zucker-Kandel, and Linus Pauling on the basis of empirical observations. They noticed that the accumulation of amino acid substitutions in hemoglobin was constant like the ticks of a clock. This led them to believe that there might be a molecular evolutionary clock that could describe changes in amino acids over time since the divergence of species. So just looking at how different parts of a genome between two different species are and trying to calculate, so there we go. Here's a nice little example. Basically what I just showed, this diagram shows how two descendant lineages diverge from a common ancestor over the course of 50 million years. Two base pair mutations means that after 50 million years, the two lineages differ by 4 base pairs, etc. So as a result of this constancy, the genetic differences between any two species is proportional to the time since these species last shared a common ancestor. Therefore, the molecular clock serves as a very useful method of estimating evolutionary timescales. And this is used for humans. This is used for plants. This is used to estimate, the time since a dispersal to a new continent happened. Okay, like silver swords to Hawaii, which of course evolved out of these little tiny annual tarweeds on the mainland in California, etc. So here's a cladogram. Here's an evolutionary tree showing distinct clades of the genus Castanea. And you can see there's a clear clade that shows dentata, American chestnuts, pumila in North America, sativa, which is in Europe, and then this whole other separate clade on the other branch between Melisma, Saginii, Henryi, Crenata, which are all China and Japan. Okay, notice that these clades are restricted to continents. Like there's the North American clade, there's this little branch off of the European clade. These things must have been up at high latitudes too, because they were probably not going all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. They were probably up at higher latitudes during much warmer time periods when those high latitudes were not completely frozen over, like Oligocene, Miocene, whatever the fuck. All right, so why was Castanea melisma more resistant to chestnut blight while Castanea dentata was not? This is the grandiose question. Why? Why would one species have absolutely no resistance to it and nearly 100% of the population is murked, while another species in the same genus that's very obviously somewhat closely related has nearly complete resistance to it? I mean, it gets infected, but it doesn't. The trees rarely die. Why would this be? Well, it's obviously because Castanea melisma, the Chinese chestnut, evolved with Cryphonectria parasitica, the chestnut blight. They evolved together in the same ecosystem together over long amounts of time. After Castanea dentata and melisma evolutionarily diverged. So sometime in the last 10 million years, this fungus was in the ecosystem of China and started eating tissue of Castanea melisma, and then probably what happened, there was an evolutionary arms race too, where the Chinese chestnuts slowly figured out a way to partition, parts of their vascular tissue off from this fungus, and then the fungus would, have a change in its enzymes, just good old phenotypic variation and natural selection, and then its enzymes would suddenly be able to work around this and digest more of the vascular tissue, work around this compartmentalization. And then, boom! Now it was the Chinese chestnuts move. The tree would figure out a way. The population would figure out a way. Would evolve a way to, then keep the fungus in check again. And boom, 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 just back and forth until eventually the Chinese chestnut is highly resistant to this fungus, and the fungus is really good at eating chestnut tissue. Right? So that's just probably, I assume that's what happened. Just probably a good old evolutionary arms race. But either way, these things were evolving together for millions of years. Okay, so millions of years in the same geographic area and in the same ecosystem, which corresponds to this geographic area. And probably the fungus has other checks and balances that keep it in check as well. If certain viral pathogens, maybe other fungi, maybe other bacteria in that ecosystem, etc. It kept the fungus in check. So everything is just working smooth, working great, not a big deal. fungus gets its bit in, it gets its little bite. The Chinese chestnuts don't get knocked down completely because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're a parasitic fungus to kill your host entirely, because soon you won't have anything left to eat. Though I believe Cryphonectria can also eat oak tissue. But anyway, in the early 1900s, Cryphonectria parasitica was unintentionally transported across an ocean on Chinese chestnut trees, I believe. And it was first spotted in the Bronx Zoo, and just started laying waste to American chestnuts, which had no defenses against it. Okay, because it's when you transport this across an ocean, across this huge barrier that's kept not only Cryphonectria parasitica in Asia, but the whole ecosystem of Asia generally separated and isolated from that of North America. It's like you're just erasing those 10 million years, and that those 10 million years of evolution that Chinese chestnuts had to evolve defenses against Cryphonectria parasitica, as Cryphonectria parasitica was slowly evolving more pathogenicity against chestnut vascular tissue. Okay, all that time is wiped away, and suddenly this fungus is exponentially better equipped than the defenses of its host. And so what happens? American chestnut trees just start dying by the thousands. And within 50 years, the tree is functionally extinct. And here's some little New York Times clippings showing, all chestnut trees here are doomed, blight extending all over the country, and not one may be left standing. Last two in Bronx dying. Trees worth millions dying in this state from a canker for which there is no remedy. Eats beneath the bark. Sprays and other attempts to check spread of the parasite unsuccessful. Trees in Botanical Park doomed. And there's this tree is just effectively being removed from this ecosystem. Just like a piece of a Jenga tower being taken out. So all the animals that rely on chestnuts as a food source, not just for seeds, but also for flowers. There were probably specialist bees that pollinated chestnut trees. In fact, I think there indeed were. I think I'm not just pulling it out of my ass. There was probably, maybe even specific mycorrhizal fungus. Everything in an ecosystem is connected. Duh, no shit. When you stop thinking like a human and start zooming out, you realize, wow, this is connected to this. One organism might be connected to 10 other organisms or 50 other organisms if it's a keystone species like Chinese chestnuts were. So the whole, parts of the ecosystem start collapsing, right? But humans don't mind. Everything's going great for us. We're doing fine, right? At least the civilization that's there now. Okay, so expanding on this theme, nearly every single heavily pathogenic tree disease or pathogen in North America is from another continent. Why? Dutch elm disease, fungus that was actually introduced to North America in the 1920s. Sudden oak death in California. It's a species of Phytophthora, not a fungus. It's actually a brown algae that became parasitic. Totally different clade evolutionary group than fungi, but regardless, very parasitic. That was introduced. Emerald ash borer is an insect that's been attacking ash trees since the mid to late 2000s. Not native to North America. Hemlock woolly adelgid, they defoliate hemlock trees in Appalachia, not native to North America. Accidentally introduced to North America from Asia in the 1920s. Oops. I presumably hemlock trees in Asia, of course, there are quite a few species, are resistant. They had time to evolve with it because they evolved with the woolly adelgid. Oak wilt, a vascular disease caused by fungal infection, not native to North America. Butternut canker, not really familiar with that one, but it's not native to North America. Chestnut blight, of course. Gypsy moths, not native. Lanternfly, of course, not native to North America. So we're starting to catch a theme. All this shit is from the worst pathogens are not from the continent. They're from other continents, right? Why would that be? Why would it be? Because oceans are the biggest barriers between ecosystems. Okay, we'll get into this more later. Right? Likewise, 99% of plants considered invasive in North America come from other continents. Tree of heaven, bufflegrass, pampas grass, Scotch broom, it's a bad one, French broom, Amur honeysuckle. Okay, really obnoxious. You could, especially the beautiful ones, I almost hate more. Right, that produces a beautiful flower because then you can imagine some fucking knob brought it to their garden thinking it was just pretty, just on pure aesthetics alone, which is that's this mindset that's tainted botany and horticulture in North America, well, all over the world. It's European in origin, I think, European and Asian in origin. But this mindset that the only purpose of growing plants is because they're useful to humans. They're the quote useful to humans. Everything's useful to us because it's a part of the fucking living machine of the biosphere. But plants are they're only worth growing if they're medicinal or a crop plant or they're pretty, whatever that means, right? It's such a weird thing. I get so tired of these delusional nut jobs, who've been schooled in archaic horticulture, thinking native plants are not pretty. They're not pretty. It's like, what is a pretty? It's supposed to flower all the fucking time, just flower constantly and just fucking look good for your dumbass. What does that mean, huh? So why would get a little mad? I don't know. I gotta let this has been the thing about this shit for 15 years. European buckthorn, horrible. I grew up in Chicago thinking the forest reserves were just shitty, boring places to go to because the whole understory was a monoculture just infested with Rhamnus cathartica. Monoculture, of course, just a landscape dominated by one species. You very rarely see that in nature unless you're in a very extreme environment like a desert, Mojave Desert. You'll see a monoculture of creosote, or alpine environments sometimes where it can be really brutal, cold, windy, etc. You might see a monoculture. Some of the alpine plants, you very rarely see monocultures, okay, in nature if it's a native plant. Cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, that's ruining the Great Basin. That's carries fire like a motherfucker too. Great. When dead cheatgrass catches fire, it's really good at incinerating the Joshua trees that are completely not adapted to fire, and then killing these beautiful old yuccas. Right, Sahara mustard. That's another bad one. It's got a thick kohlrabi-like root. It's invading the Mojave Desert, the Colorado River watershed, etc. Kudzu. Hopefully everybody knows about that. Kudzu down there in the south, right? Pueraria montana. Pueraria. I love it when people try to correct your pronunciation. Shut up. Get the fuck out of here. Burning bush, Euonymus elatus. That's a bad one. Oh, God. Tamarix, ramosissima, salt cedar. Left off a couple. Berberis thunbergii. That's a pretty hideous one. Another one that's idiotically planted in horticulture in the East Coast. Why does this stuff? Why do people plant this stuff? It's just because it's what's available and they don't think. And our whole way of viewing plants is so deranged and perverted and disconnected from reality, from biological and ecological reality. It's a disease. So what is a native plant, right? A plant species or lineage that evolved in the general region where it presently occurs and has been there for geologically long amounts of time, referencing the geologic time scale, which has evolved relationships with the other organisms there, including but not limited to symbiotic soil fungi, pathogenic fungi, bacteria, microherbivores, macroherbivores, fruit and seed dispersers, pollinators, etc. Every region on Earth has its own caste of native plant species. When I realized this, and that every region has a caste of native plant species which evolved there over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, it made, and I realized every species had a connection to like 15 to 100 to 500 other species. It made me want to fucking travel so much more than I'd ever wanted to. It made me so curious to see what grew in these places, before human transoceanic travel started moving shit around, fucking things up, right? Right? Because when you're moving things from one ecosystem to another, it's like trying to put a piece from a fucking Honda Prelude into a 1989 Buick, right? Doesn't work. Doesn't always work. Sometimes it's not going to be that bad. Sometimes you might be able to jerry rig it. It's not going to be catastrophic. Other times it's going to lead to complete fucking disasters, and the whole car is going to shit the bed. Okay? And this is something that people don't get who don't like the idea of native plants, because you'll hear this a lot. You'll hear this, well, how far back do you have to go to a point in time when something was native? It's not about going back to a point in time. It's going back it's not about going back. It's about looking at the whole ecosystem as a functioning machine, realizing every fucking species has a function, a pragmatic part, except for mosquitoes and ticks, fuck them, has a pragmatic part in that machine. It's about looking at the whole living machine. It's not about some, 1491 or any of this shit. It's, oh, you'll never go back to that. It's not about that. It's about looking at how things function. Okay, when you've got a monoculture of bufflegrass or European buckthorn causing extinctions, invasive species are one of the main causes of extinctions and extirpations, local extinctions. That's not a good thing. That's not about some idea of purity or any of that. These permaculture people, no offense, not all permaculture people, hashtag not all permaculture, right? But some of them are just really resistant. They've got such an anthropocentric fucking lens still that they just can't get out of, that they're just stuck in this idea of, no species is, or they're super soft. They just don't like the idea of demonizing any species. And it's not about demonizing a species. It's about demonizing the presence of one thing in one place as and the detrimental effect it's having. Eucalyptus are fucking great. I've seen blue gum eucalyptus globulus in Tasmania. They're fucking great trees. They're epic. They fit into the ecosystem. They don't dominate. They get these massive fucking trunks. They get huge, really, really like 300 feet tall. Some of them, epic trees. They're great, and they don't. And you can tell they're native there. They behave in a native way. They with checks and balances. There's other stuff growing with them. They're not forming these huge monocultures. You could see there's other species interacting with them. You see them in coastal California forming monocultures on the hillsides. And it's very obvious they're not native there. Nothing is using them. Nothing is, I mean, what, the monarchs roost in them once in a while? The monarchs would roost in a fucking field of telephone poles. Who gives a shit? There's nothing that can utilize them. They're a desert for wildlife and for all the other pieces of that living world in California. Fuck them, get rid of them. I couldn't believe there was resistance against that. There was a campaign to get rid of blue gum eucalyptus in the Oakland Hills, and these well-intentioned hippies, just totally clueless, the permaculture people fought it. And I couldn't, knowing what would be there otherwise, which is, California madrones, California bay laurel, coast live oak, the species richness that's just so cool, silk tassel, all this stuff that would be there otherwise were it not for these shitty eucalyptus. How could anyone be against that? And walking through a native California coastal woodland and seeing the species and hearing the fucking scrub jays and all the other cool insects and birds and salamanders and lizards and shit that are in there, and being against that and wanting this monoculture of these shitty eucalypts, it blows my mind. But again, they didn't know because they'd never experienced it, and they weren't cut in enough to realize that they weren't cut in enough to realize the own paucity of their experiences, that they didn't even realize what a native woodland looked like. Right. And I used to be like that. I used to be, making fun of native plant purists and blah, blah. And it's bullshit. Oh, yeah, as the freeway native, it doesn't matter. I was being a dummy. It finally came around. And when I did, it really enriched my whole outlook on everything. It's about the amount of time that these things have spent evolving together. Okay. Understanding how evolution works, understanding how natural selection works, how a species of plant can be selected for, that is, its evolution will be directly affected by the things that pollinate it or that prey on it, or the fungi that it's symbiotic with, that allow it to grow in soil that's so fucking toxic it might not otherwise be able to grow in, or toxic or nutrient poor soil. The mycorrhizae in some cases allow that. Right? So what's an invasive plant? A plant from a distant, disparate ecosystem that behaves extremely aggressively in the one that it was brought to by humans, in which it would not otherwise have been able to disperse to without human help. Invasive plants are most often from other continents, so they lack the ecological checks and balances that prevent them from forming monocultures back home. You realize this too. What keeps plants in check, right? Herbivores, I guess, right? Deer a little bit, but mostly it's insects and fungi. Those are the two biggest pathogens and hindrances the plants, viruses sometimes, maybe whatever. But those are the two biggest things that mess with if a plant is in a climate that is otherwise suitable for it, but it's not thriving, it's probably due to insect pressure, or fungal pressure. And so when these things evolve in a native ecosystem, well, first off, they don't just suddenly appear. The lineage has probably been in that ecosystem forever. The lineage of fungi or insects. So there have been baby steps, to give the plant time to, that evolutionary arms race. Like chestnut blight did not just suddenly appear in Asia. Okay, it had a common ancestor that was probably less pathogenic than it is now. At a time when Chinese chestnuts had less defenses than they do now. So the lineage itself has been on that continent or in that ecosystem for a long time. It don't just appear suddenly. Okay, but either way, the point is that the plant has time to adapt. So it's this amount of time, this coevolution in an ecosystem, in a place that allows for these things to gradually adjust to each other. Okay. In the case that maybe a bird, well, first off, not many birds fly across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. Most migration patterns are north-south, which we'll show later. But in the case that, a fucking chestnut blight or some other pathogenic fungus or insect, prior to human transport across oceans got to another continent, would it cause extinctions? Probably. Yeah, I'm sure it happened, but certainly not at the rate that we're doing it now. We have caused thousands of these switching pieces from one continental ecosystem to another over the last 200 years alone than have ever been caused in the last probably 30 million. Right? I mean, who knows what happened when the higher latitudes warmed and shit was able to move? But again, it was gradual. It wasn't over 2 weeks of ship travel or a overnight airplane flight. So anyway, that's what an invasive plant is. An invasive plant is not just something that's aggressive. Like, people get this wrong all the time. They'll call, like here in Texas, you'll hear people say, which is not surprising to me because see a lot of dumb shit in this state, no offense. But I'll hear people say, mesquite is invasive, or cedar, they're talking about juniper, is invasive. Remember, there's no true cedars native to North America. The genus Cedrus is strictly Eurasian. They'll say cedars are native or invasive. Well, not really, because they're native here. They're aggressive. And, they're probably dominating because of fire suppression or overgrazing, etc. Overgrazing is such a big thing. I didn't realize. Someone was explaining holistic grazing to me, and they're like, "Yeah, you just move them, you just rotate cattle." And I was like, "Isn't that what you should already do if you're if you're a rancher?" I mean, plants will, there's a threshold at which they just get nibbled to the ground. They can't come back. They need time. A landscape needs time to regenerate. You'd think that was common sense. You'd think that was fucking pragmatism. It doesn't need a fancy name. It doesn't need an instruction manual. That's just common fucking sense. But that's not what's common. That's what a lot of ranchers will do is just pack a lot of cattle onto a piece of property and just let them fucking it's crazy. I don't understand it. I can understand if you're like a small rancher in Mexico, don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of land, you're not able to rotate. But a lot of these ranchers in Texas have shit tons of money and acreage. It's fucking crazy to me. Wouldn't you rotate? Like, that's just common fucking sense. It doesn't need a fancy, anyway, whatever. I'm going off on a tangent. Oh, the other thing that pisses me off too is this idea that humans are invasive. That's just not what the term means. You can say, look, I'm all for making the comparison between modern civilization and a tumor cell. That's fine. That's great. You're not gonna have any pushback from me on that, right? I'm not gonna call you an eco-fascist like some of these fucking nitwit college kids or any of the dumb shit that's out there on leftist Twitter circa 2020, any of that, right? I think that's an idiotic term. There's just I understand where it comes from because the rich always tend to fucking hoard everything for themselves and miss the whole idea that their impact is the strongest. But I'm not going to push back on that. There's a carrying capacity, and you cross that, and you start seeing decline of the biosphere. You start infringing on the rights of the whole fucking ecosystem to exist and other living things to exist, etc. It's a very shitty and selfish way to behave as a species. It's anthropocentric. Left does it, the right does it. Both sides do it. But humans are just not invasive. That's just not the right that's not the right usage of the term. Okay, invasive means brought by humans. Okay, not that it got there itself. You could say, well, we brought ourselves. Okay, that's just semantics, though. Humans got to these places on account of their own accord. They could get there anyway. Okay, so there's all you could go. You can get into nuts and bolts of the terminology, but it's just not ecologically. It means brought by humans. It means a species that was transported by humans, generally from one continental ecosystem to the next. All right. Um, and not to mention the whole concept of free will. Like humans have a choice. Like there's a void of leadership in our civilization, right? And we are for the most part herd animals. We're conformists, and we just follow whatever. But there's a void of leadership. If we lived in a society that had a more biocentric, less anthropocentric viewpoint, we wouldn't necessarily behave like this. I don't think we're destined to behave like this. This is kind of just the way that we're going right now. I think there's potential. I don't think it's going to happen till I'm more of a catastrophist, right? Shit's got to hit the fan before we stop acting like dummies. But the point is like we're at least there's a self-awareness, there's a free will, whatever. And it just sounds like a deflective point too. Someone says someone people say shit like humans are invasive when they don't want to face the fact that you're calling something like feral cats or their favorite horticultural atrocity plant invasive. They use it as a way to deflect and just kind of in a shit for brain manner try to work around the argument. So that's why I don't buy that. It's fucking stupid. And it's just wrong. It's not correct. Call humans cancerous, call them aggressive, call them pathological, tell them, say human society acts like a tumor on the face of planet Earth, and we're going to turn it into an ashtray and fuck it into a coma. That's fine. Right? But call it invasive. It's just stupid. It doesn't make sense. It's not right. Look at here we go. Invasion Biology 101. You can normally tell if a plant is invasive due to how it behaves in an ecosystem. For instance, it will form unchecked monocultures. Here's kudzu in the American South. Here's Scotch broom in Washington. I'm telling you, man, it's something about the quote pretty invasives that makes me hate them more. Like mullein. I fucking hate mullein. It's really bad out west. It doesn't tend to be that bad in the humid east, as far as I've seen. But I've seen monocultures of mullein in Northern California forests. And if I have to hear that mullein is medicinal one more time, I'm going to shit on the feet of whoever says it. Actually, you know what? I shouldn't put it like that because there are some sick fucks out there with some weird fetishes. I shouldn't say that. But you know what I mean. I'll shit on the doorstep, okay? Or in a mailbox. It's medicinal. I don't care. Who gives a fuck? Yeah, go smoke it then. What's wrong? What do you get? You get like a health issue? What do you need to? Maybe I need to smoke some mullein. I just got over RSV from my 4-year-old. Okay, anyway, there's that yellow flower from that Scotch broom. There's kudzu in the American South. Both are in the same family, the pea family, Fabaceae, even the same subfamily, Faboideae. And God, it's just, you could see the way they're behaving. Kudzu. Does kudzu behave like this in Asia where it's native? No. Why is that? Because it's got insects that keep it in check. I think there's a beetle. There's probably a ton of shit that eats kudzu. Right? Now, should we bring those over to Eastern North America too? No, because there's a ton of Eastern North American plants in this family that beetle and those insects and maybe even whatever fungi eat this thing. There's a ton of related species. Always got to look at the family it's in that would probably become food for those pathogens, for those insects too, and then they would become pathogens, unchecked pathogens in Eastern North American ecosystems, okay? You don't want to go just willy-nilly throwing pieces from that Honda Prelude into the 1989 Buick. Okay? You just don't, it's not you don't fight fire with fire. It's not a way, that's not a solution. It's pretty shit for brain, and it has backfired many times. There's been one or two cases where it hasn't, like when prickly pear invaded Australia, which we'll talk about, but that's not here. Here's another bad one, waxy leaf privet, right? An escapee, okay, broke out from shitty suburban horticultural plantings and became one of the most invasive plants in Texas. Here's a monoculture it's forming. This is in outside of Dallas. Look at that. It looks like shit. Spread by birds. Okay, the birds eat it. This is nothing I hear from an invasive species apologists all the time. One or two species in an ecosystem will be found to exploit an invasive plant. Great, that's great. But you know what? No invasive is going to be able to do a job or perform a function better than anything that's native. And it's just, and there's going to be a cost to it as well. Right? We got to stop looking at this narrow-minded, shitty. I mean, it's just bad logic too. Oh, it does this one thing. Okay, well, what are the negative things it does? You know, the negative things that waxy leaf and Chinese privet do are form these shitty, ugly, extensive monocultures that choke and smother things like limestone prairie. This I was here to see Silphium albiflorum, really cool landscape, and this entire area back here was just choked with privet, absolutely fucking heinous, and probably covered in ticks. The ticks love dense stands like this because it retains the humidity, and ticks don't like drying out, and they can get up on the leaves and put their legs out to jump on to not jump on, but to get picked up by anything that walks by them, whether it's a deer or a person. So I want to just burn all this down. Just want to fight those. Some of those junipers probably need to go too. This is privet. It's really bad. All right, cut them. Paint the stumps with Roundup. All right, no Roundup. Oh yeah. Invasive eucalyptus forming monocultures in California. There you go. There's that blue gum eucalyptus. Beautiful tree, beautiful bark, but there's just nothing growing there, and it forms that thick duff that just suppresses anything. Doesn't seem to suppress poison oak, which is hilarious, but everything else it seems to suppress from growing. This is probably how Psilocybe cyanescens and Eleni made it from Australia, where they originated, to North America. Psychoactive wood decomposing mushroom species. Berberis thunbergii in eastern woodlands. If you live in the East Coast, you know this one. Horrible plant. Often what gets sold is the ornamental species. It's got the red leaves. But of course, the seedlings that it produces don't come true to form. That recessive allele for those flushed red leaves probably gets flushed out, no pun intended, pretty quick. And you get this. And it just forms, again, that looks like a shitty forest. Humans like open canopy forest. We don't want to go into these. I don't want to, at least. I can just be checking myself for ticks the whole time, having to walk through these dense thickets of, invasive bullshit. That's erect woodland. That is erect area. Right. So this brings us to shifting baseline syndrome. So being that so many of us grow up with absolutely no connection to the living world around us, except from what we see in zoos or in the fucking landscaping beds in front of Wells Fargo or CVS, we have no idea what we're missing. We have no idea what a, quote, natural, and I don't even like that word, landscape would look like, what the living machine would look like. And remember, it's not about going back to some mythical point in time. It's about having all the pieces, or as many as you can get, of that living machine together, because they keep each other in check, getting them on the landscape together so that everything is somewhat in balance. Because if there's one thing that will happen eventually in time in any ecosystem, is a balance will be reached. And it's not static, it's not constant. There'll be upheavals and whatever, but it generally, the waves always settle. You have too much of something will evolve to eventually exploit it as a food source, etc. Whether it's deer or whether it's a certain plant or whatever, it's just common sense. Okay, nothing is going to last for nothing's going to have a boom cycle that lasts forever. Something evolves to always keep it in check. And that's kind of the wonderful thing about natural selection and evolution when it blends with the whole concept of ecology. When you start to understand these things, evolution and ecology go hand in hand, right? So shifting baseline syndrome describes a gradual change in our accepted norms and expectations for the environment across generations. Our tolerance for environmental degradation increases and our expectations for the natural world are lowered. Younger generations think that what they grow up with is normal, having no idea that they are inheriting the ecological ruins of a landscape that was destroyed a century before by shitty management practices and entire culture that's disconnected from the living world around it. And, due to maybe its monotheistic religion, thinks that the whole world was put there for it to begin with. Completely fucking deranged, lacking gratitude and respect. I don't really understand it, but that's what we're raised in. Anyway, for example, bison are absent from 98% of their historic range. That must have been a fucking wonderful thing to see. Anyway, um, so you got this with this diagram. I don't know who made this little cartoon on the left. It's great. It shows 1800, an ocean full of 30 different species of organisms, corals, fish, whales, etc. 1950, half of them are gone. In 2019, you got a couple plastic bags floating in there too. That's nice. I like that little cynical twist. And you get a good, maybe 5 species of fish left. Most of the corals dead. Oh, there's a starfish down there. That's nice. Okay, and then over here we've got this other example of shifting baselines. From time increasing from left to right. The far past on the left, the present on the right, and the fish species, the size and species diversity going down. Right. We see this in landscapes. Like I grew up thinking that the forest preserves in Chicago were boring and shitty because they were dominated by buckthorn. Duh, of course they were boring and shitty. All the cool spring ephemerals, all the claytonia, all the trout lilies were being suppressed and eradicated because they couldn't outcompete buckthorn for light. That buckthorn, that shitty European buckthorn that grew in the understory, suppressed the light during that brief window when the forest above was still deciduous, but temperatures had warmed up. And there were no leaves in the trees yet, but temperatures were starting to warm up. And, all the fucking trilliums, the skunk cabbage, all that shit just was slowly being extirpated by this invasive plant, which now people are finally starting to control for. But buckthorn's everywhere. It's going to be there forever. Does that mean, oh, you'll never get rid of it? Just so don't try? No, I mean, it's if you got diagnosed with a cancer that they, like some leukemias that will be with you for your whole life, but that you can live with and keep managed, for your whole life by taking a pill. In other words, you'll have cancer your whole life, but it's not going to kill you as long as you take this pill. Would you not take the pill because you're never going to get it all? No, you're still going to take the fucking pill. You're going to keep the cancer managed so that you can continue living. That's what we do with our ecosystems. You're never going to get rid of some of these invasive species, all right? Most of them. But that's not the point. The point is to keep them in check, hopefully until something that's native evolves to exploit them, which might take 500,000 fucking years, but still, which is eternity as far as we're concerned, but still. You keep those invasives in check because you want to prevent extinctions and extirpation of some of the cool native species, not just because they're cool, but because they're these essential cogs in this living machine. They serve a function. Our dumbasses might not know it yet because the field of ecology is still only 80 to 90 years old, but you keep these things around. You don't just let them go out. The whole concept of just you're never going to get it all, that's just, again, that's completely shit for brains. Right? That's just not realistic. You manage them. We're going to be affecting the landscape either way. We might as well do it intelligently via study, via observation of data, by paying attention to what we're doing, etc., than just by doing it lazily. It's by doing it unintentionally. So here's a great example of fire suppression. Right, fire was a huge part of Native American management throughout North America, as well as in Australia, Aboriginal culture, etc. Right, because it's one of the easiest tools you can use to manage an ecosystem. I watched a cool video yesterday on fire, how fire suppression is partly responsible for the boom in tick populations and Lyme disease in Eastern North America, especially the Northeast, over the last century or two. Okay, it makes sense, right? You eradicate that, you burn that duff off, you burn the ticks, you keep doing it, and eventually tick populations are going to go down. They don't like fire, but you have to keep burning every couple of years. You have to, probably, culling some of the deer would be important as well. If land managers decided to, and if it was agreed on by enough people over a large enough area, you could get rid of the ticks, or at least heavily cause their populations to plummet in the Northeast by burning, by treating, giving those permethrin, they had cotton balls to mice to use for nesting, by trying to culling half the deer, treating the rest, somehow, like you could invent some sort of like feed thing where they go in, they get food, they get sprayed with the otherwise harmless permethrin and pyrethroids, etc. I mean, this is something that could be done, but anyway. And the whole reason the tick population got that bad in the first place is because of fire suppression. But I digress. Anyway, you can see here, this is based on the Great Basin. Juniper has taken over due to fire suppression. And so you've lost this whole diversity of forbs and other shit that grows in these areas. And the juniper's taken over. Right. So fire was constant, it was a big tool in the Western North America as well as Eastern North America. Right. Opens up the understory of forests for hunting, burns off dead plant material, leads to a huge burst of growth the following spring. Right. Fire is a disturbance. Right. You get the same thing when you bulldoze sometimes, like when you just clear certain areas. Heard about some case of these Calopogon oklahomensis orchids coming back in someone's property in eastern Texas after they just cleared a bunch of the ilex, native ilex, vomitoria, etc. It was just acted as a disturbance that enabled more diversity. They went and the people did, the landowners did, cleared this ilex, bulldoze. I don't know if they went over with a masticator or what, but they just cleared it, and all this Calopogon popped up that had been there probably for 50, 60 years. Okay, so this is European buckthorn in Illinois. This is what the forest looks like. Just shitty. Just as shitty. This is what I grew up with thinking is normal. Look at that. Just fucking miserable. It looks shitty. There's ticks everywhere. You walk 10 feet into that, you come out covered in 20 ticks. Because there's deer everywhere too, because the predators, the wolves and the mountain lions have been wiped out as well. Which is insane. So these deer are just deer really, I'm not a fan. To a point I am, but they got to be controlled. Their populations have to be kept down. So that's what European buckthorn did. And here's what's been going on in some places in the Midwest. You get before and after. There's before and after photos. I think this was in Michigan. This might have been in Indiana. I forget where. But look at how nice that landscape in the after photo looks for hanging out in. It's open. You don't have to worry about brushing up a bunch of shit getting covered in ticks. And there's this monoculture of this shitty buckthorn is gone. What keeps buckthorn in check? I've heard buckthorn is actually kind of rare in Europe. So I don't know. I'm so curious to go to Europe and see what few ecosystems are left. I always imagine Europe. I mean, it's culturally wonderful and you're not trapped in a car, but I imagine so much of the wilderness is just fucked. Because the death cult that we're living under now, that's where it all started, Europe and the Middle East. Anyway, okay. Examples of a Sonoran desert landscape showing the characteristic arrangement of patches of native vegetation separated by bare ground. Look at that. Beautiful Sonoran desert landscape on the left, uninvaded by the buffalo grass, which has since moved in. On the right, buffalo grass is an exotic grass from equatorial Africa, evolved with megafauna, these huge animals just tearing it to shreds. And so the animals kind of selected for how robust and fast the buffalo grass grows. So it's not the quote buffalo grass's fault if we want to take this, juvenile anthropomorphic viewpoint. Okay, it's not the buffalo grass's fault. This sounds idiotic, but you know what I mean. It's just the buffalo grass is doing what it evolved to do. It's fucking great at what it does in its native habitat. There's nothing to keep it in check here. There's no fungus. There's no insect that keeps it in check, and it forms these huge monocultures which smother and decrease species diversity of plants. Which then, once those plants are gone, remember you're removing pieces from the Jenga tower. Once those plants are gone, now you start losing the insects and animals that depend on them. And so you get a more homogenized, boring monoculture of an ecosystem. It's really shitty and it's a shame and it sucks to walk through places like this. It's fucking heart sinking, especially if you know what used to be there in some of these places. Watched it happen myself in the Rio Grande Valley. 2014, I showed up. I caught the tail end of all the cool cactus diversity and some of these understories of mesquite woodlands. Went back 10 years later, they're fucking wrecked, smothered in buffalo grass and guinea grass, and all the cacti are gone, and the javelina and feral pigs have gone unchecked. Nobody shoots them. No predators eat them. Jaguars or mountain lions have been basically wiped out. Still a couple mountain lions in the West Valley, I think, but And so the pigs went in, uproot the cactus to eat the roots, and then the cacti just slowly wither and die, and it's just a fucking mess. It's really sad. And knowing what was there, even in 2014, and seeing what's there now, it makes me feel so bad. Like it feels terrible. You're like, God, it sucks. It's like watching a fucking museum or a library or some like your favorite museum you used to go to as a kid get turned into a fucking Dollar General. That's what it feels like. All right. I could think of some more shitty analogies probably. I should do that sometime. Maybe on next long car ride. Here's buffalo grass. Here's what it does in South Texas. Look at that. Look at that. Just shitty monoculture. You could see that, not know anything about the plant, and say, yeah, it's probably invasive. You rarely see native plants behaving like that, behaving in an ecosystem. How does something behave in an ecosystem? I want you to think about that next time you go take a fucking waltz down a hiking trail. Huh? Think about it. Okay. Likewise, these generational patterns of what the fuck is this? Where is this coming from? Oh, this is a disc. This is from something else. Anyway, so these patterns of biogeography, species being restricted to continents, genera being restricted to continents, the whole family or subfamily of a taxonomic lineage of plants being restricted to a continent because those oceans are what keep things from moving over the last 20, 30, 50 million years, etc., explains why species are so invasive in some places. Okay? When prickly pears got introduced to Australia, they got introduced there for the production of cochineal, which is this scale insect that forms a white material on prickly pear pads. Looks like someone's like some sick fuck took their shitty toilet paper and threw it on a prickly pear pad, and then it rained on it, and it just that's literally what this cochineal scale looks like. You take it in your fingers and you smush it, and it turns a beautiful bright red. And it's what the Zapotecs in southern Mexico were using for dyeing fabric and fibers for the last, however many dozens of centuries. And it's a really cool dye that's harvested from this insect. And so the prickly pears were brought there for that. Guess what? They broke out, not surprisingly. Nothing eats them. The sheep and goats that are, ruining the rest of the ecosystem can't even eat these. And there's no insects or fungi that have evolved to keep this in check. So what happens? It was introduced in the late 1700s. By the late 1800s, prickly pear had taken over huge swaths of eastern Australia, just forming monocultures. That looks like shit. And I love cacti, but this looks like garbage. This looks like fucking shit. I remember being in New Zealand and seeing a monoculture of redwoods, a tree that I love, planted, but it felt so empty. It felt so weird and felt just like a desert because there was nothing else from the redwood forest there. It was just redwoods and nothing could grow under them. It felt like eucalyptus in California. In New Zealand, nothing could grow beneath these redwoods. So it was basically a plantation of redwoods with no ferns, none of the cool trilliums, nothing else, none of the oxalis growing beneath it. It was just it looked deranged. It looked like a human perversion of the natural world, which is what it was. So anyway, what did Australia do about this? Well, if you want to find what something's natural checks and balances might be, you go to where it evolved for millions of years. And so that's what was found. This Cactoblastis cactorum moth from South America. And luckily, because Australia has been basically isolated from the entire rest of the world for 50 million years, there was nothing native that was closely related to cactus that this moth could go for or potentially even evolve to eat after it was done with the cactus. So they introduced it and it worked. It reduced. I don't have a photo. I should have put one up, but it reduced by like 90% these patches of cactus. Prickly pear is still invasive in Australia. It's still there. It didn't eradicate it completely. Okay, because remember, only an invasive, only something that prickly pear didn't evolve with could probably end up wiping it out completely, like happened with American chestnuts and chestnut blight. But this moth took it down like 90%. And it worked. It was a great biocontrol, but you should normally not do that. That's normally a bad idea because again, this worked in Australia because there was nothing else closely related to cacti. But if you did this in somewhere, even in Africa, there's things that are closely enough related to cacti that whatever the biocontrol for cactus was could potentially and eventually move to. And before you even do this, you should test it on all these different things first, right? This is what we should be doing as a species right now, is learning how the ecosystem works, learning how these pieces of the ecosystem work, decoding their whole genome, putting it in a database somewhere, et cetera, really looking at the nuts and bolts of all these different pieces. Okay, so the broader brush. So contrary to how we are taught to view plants in pop culture as potted collector items of novelty or aesthetic beauty that have been removed from the ecological context in which they evolve, we got to realize that no plant is an autonomous entity, but a part of a larger ecosystem in which it functions as a cog in a larger living machine. Further, it's not just individual species that evolve, but all the species in an entire ecosystem that evolve together. Okay, so a specific insect may pollinate a specific plant or use a specific plant as a host. And further, uh, a certain plant may evolve defenses to a certain insect, which then has to evolve a certain response to it so that it can continue exploiting its food source. And now the plant, same thing, that's this co-evolutionary arms race that's been going on, for instance, between butterflies and their host plants for millions of years. They evolve together. All right. No species is an island. No species exists in a vacuum. Individual species evolve, populations evolve, lineages of plants evolve, and all the organisms that those plants have relationships with evolve as well, all together. All right. It's as a constant cause and effect, a constant back and forth, just like it's literally a fucking machine. So it's the ecosystem itself that evolves, as though the ecosystem itself is an individual entity, or to hammer it in again, a living machine. This means that the individual species that compose these ecosystems evolve relationships with each other. Zoom out. Don't just focus on this one thing, zoom out. That whole, going back to that potted plant analogy, though, this whole idea of just viewing a plant by itself in a pot and then missing out on the context in which that plant evolves, missing out on the ecological context. When I started piecing this shit together, it made it so hard for me to get away from the idea of native plants. Like, I didn't become a purist, but it just made everything else seem so fucking boring. It was like, man, I want what's native to either the region or, maybe a couple hundred miles south in Mexico and could evolve here, whatever. And maybe, the way that's the other thing, is the way that distributions shift over time. I get local ecotypes. I get that. But some people are really like, I only want what's native to my certain valley. I don't want anything that's native from, even 60 miles away is too far away. It's like, well, yeah, okay. But you gotta, again, you're taking too narrow an approach. The way that the climate has shifted over time, and that these distribution patterns have shifted over time. This thing might have fucking grown here 50,000 years ago. But what probably wasn't growing here 50,000 years ago was shit from a continent 5,000 miles away, because it had no way to get across that ocean. So again, I tend to focus on continents. There are very few exceptions to that invasives come from other continents idea. Robinia, the locust tree, is one example. They're native in Eastern North America. They can become very invasive in certain areas in Western North America. But again, they don't behave as invasively, and it's directly observable, as invasives that are from completely different continents do, that have been separated for much longer amounts of time, right? And you can tell that. But there are a couple exceptions to that continental rule in terms of invasive potential. Okay, so can an ecosystem be considered a living machine? Yes, an ecosystem can be considered a living machine because it is a complex, interconnected system where various living organisms and their non-living environment interact dynamically, with each element playing a vital role in maintaining the balance and functioning of the whole, similar to how parts of a machine work together to produce a result. Essentially, it's a self-regulating system that constantly adapts and responds to changes within its environment. What are some of the things that ecosystems do for us? Flood control, pest control, right? If you have the reason some mosquitoes and ticks get so bad is because we've fucked up the ecosystem so much. I mean, again, nothing exists in overabundance without something eventually evolving to keep it in check. There are insects that eat mosquitoes. There are birds and other things and mammals and other insects that eat ticks. But again, we've fucked things up so bad that we've enabled some of these pathogens to thrive without trying to either find out what keeps them in check or help thrive what keeps them in check in an ecosystem. First off, most of the mosquitoes, at least where I live, are not even native to North America. Aedes aegypti, some of the tiger mosquitoes. Okay, and that's a species that's been evolving with people, thriving on people for uh, quite a many millennia. Anyway, but yeah, there's pest control. Uh, Another great example, pest control. We used to get these really bad invasive cockroaches where I live. I killed my lawn. I started planting a bunch of the native plants, created a bunch of habitat for like 3 or 4 different species of lizards, as well as some amphibians, like the chirping frogs and the Gulf Coast toads. And now those, I don't get many of those cockroaches anymore. Well, with palmetto bugs or whatever the fuck they call them. They're not palmetto bugs. They're like the German and African cockroaches. Presumably, those lizards or something is eating them, is exploiting them as a food source. Flood control, that's pretty easy. The native plants, the native living skin of the earth helps hold the soil together, helps moisture get absorbed, prevents runoff, something lawn is extremely shitty at doing because the roots of lawn don't go deep. Climate control, the whole evapotranspirational cooling thing, which blows my mind why people will bulldoze land in South Texas before they sell it, thinking that it increases the value. Like fucking idiots. Microbes maintain soil health. Whole invisible world down there, multiple species, many of which are probably undescribed, bacteria, um, protists, fungi, etc., all interacting. Microbes maintain soil health. Duh, no shit. Fixing nitrogen, creating more carbon, making that fluffy soil that can be so beneficial for plants versus like a tight compacted soil, etc. Um, Plants preventing erosion, soil loss, river watershed quality maintained by plant cover and aquatic organisms, which can also act as great filters, protection against adverse weather events, etc. So there's many reasons to start trying to integrate this living world, especially the native living world, because that's the one that's going to run the smoothest as a machine back into our fucking infrastructure. Why are we not doing this yet? I don't know. Why is like the whole concept of native plants, native anything, viewed as like some purist fad? It's not. It's just pragmatism, man. That's all it is. It's just pragmatic. Okay. This goes back to the continent idea. I drew a little diagram showing continents separating at the seafloor spreading center in the middle with the little zigzag transform faults. Half the plate goes one way, and then the other plate goes the other way, east west. When we start to think about what physically separates ecosystems and isolates them and all their component parts, i.e., species, we realize that the main barriers are oceans. In this way, we start to see ecosystems as somewhat continental phenomenon. What's to stop one plant genus? A species might be restricted to a certain region on a continent, but what's to stop that genus from reaching the other end of the continent? Eventually, might take a few million years, but it's going to make it there eventually. It's going to make it up and over mountain ranges. It's going to make it across great swaths of windy, high, dry prairie. It's going to make it across swamps. It's going to make it to the other coast eventually. There's nothing to really separate it, right? Because plants grow on land. So it might take baby steps. The genus Eriogonum occurs coast to coast. There's much more diversity out west where it seems to thrive more. It's a much more arid, adapted genus. But the genus Eriogonum occurs in Appalachia as well, too. Eriogonum ellenii in Virginia. Eriogonum multiflorum down here in Texas. So what's the genus Eriogonum has made it across the whole continent. But it takes a while, but it does it eventually. But what can plants not do? What can they not do? They can't grow in open ocean. They can't transverse 3,000 miles of ocean by themselves, right? When we look at, let's take a look at the flight patterns, migration patterns. Here we go. Here's bird migration patterns. You can see none of these go really. I mean, you got Alaska to Asia there, but aside from that, and Alaska is an extremely cold environment. So maybe when it warms up, we'll start seeing more plants from Asia getting established. But um, there's none that go across the Atlantic. There's none. I guess you got a couple here from, like, again, high latitude in eastern North America going to Asia, or not to Asia, to Africa and Europe, but nothing from lower latitude, non-frigid parts. So you're not getting these blending of continental ecosystems, right? These continental ecosystems are pretty much well kept for the most part. You get a lot of north-south movement, like up from coastal California to coastal Chile. You can, of course, you get plants that occur there, same genera, if not the same species in some cases, but you don't get a lot of east to west movement, either across the Atlantic or the Pacific, right? So these oceans again act as these barriers, these isolation barriers, these barriers to dispersal, and also these vicarious barriers, these things that separate not only ecosystems but entire lineages, right? So again, like I said, Ariogena millenniae might only occur in Virginia and Appalachia, but it's not going to occur, in California, but the genus will. The genus Eriogonum will. And many of those same traits, the phytochemistry, a disposition towards rapid speciation, a disposition towards producing hairs, a disposition towards dry environments, those same traits are going to be within the same genus. Same species may not be everywhere across the continent, but the same genus will, right? And so if there's a certain insect that can prey on an Eriogonum species, it can probably prey on another Eriogonum species. You could basically prey on the whole Eriogonum genus itself, etc. So again, this is where this understanding of taxonomy and plant systematics becomes important in understanding how things evolve and how ecology works, etc. So again, this focus on lineage, right? So the same species might not be widespread over a continent, but the same genus or family, the same lineage, generally will, having different species or genera occupying different climates and biomes and niches of the same continent. Further plant distribution shift on the same continent over time. What is now native to Tennessee may have been native to Canada prior to glaciation, or even native to Wyoming prior to continental drying in the American West. And the uplift of the Rocky Mountains. What's to stop a plant genus or family that exists on the coast of one continent from eventually reaching the opposite coast? What I just said, right? What will isolate not just species but entire lineages are oceans. So continental ecosystems are contained by oceans. And it starts to make sense why, for instance, certain tree pathogens prove deadly to North American tree species that have resistant congeners overseas. Because that whole clade, for instance, of chestnut, the whole genus chestnut might be both in Asia and North America. But that clade, there's a distinct North American group, evolutionary group of chestnut, the genus Castanea, that's restricted to North America. And again, molecular clock dating tells us it's been isolated from the other one, the other clade, the Asian clade, for 10 million fucking years. That's a long time. Okay, a lot of things can evolve in that amount of time. Okay, now we're moving to pantropical distribution. Just talking about more biogeography, not so much invasion biology here. When a plant, genus, family, or species occurs naturally in a region without human transport, we refer to this as its distribution. Pantropical distribution, when a tropical species or family occurs around the globe at low latitudes. This tends to be a common phenomenon at tropical latitudes due to a uniform climate and rainfall patterns at these latitudes, as well as oceanic dispersal, floating seeds like coconuts. Okay, Ericaceae, Moraceae, figs and mulberries. Ericaceae is the palms, Rubiaceae, coffee family. A lot of these are families that have pantropical distributions. Different genera, different families, but the family is tends to be a tropical family, and it tends to be somewhat widespread. Uniform rainfall, uniform temperature, uniform humidity, etc. Okay. Amphitropical distribution, like we talked about before, between California and Chile, for example, is a type of disjunct distribution where a species or clade exists at comparable latitudes, clade like a genus or family, across the equator, but not in the tropics. Okay, because the conditions at the equator are much different than than you would get at these, higher latitudes, like 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south in South America. Encilia does the same thing. There's a cool Encilia native to South America, Encilia canescens. There's plenty of Phaceolias that do the same thing. Members of the phlox family, members of the Boraginaceae. Creosote bush, of course, we got one North American species and like 5 in South America from the same latitude, but on the opposite side of the equator. Amphitropical distribution. On the other hand, some plant families are restricted to certain hemispheres. Cactus family is entirely restricted to North and South America. If you see a cactus, except for one species, outside of North and South America, it was planted in the last few hundred years. Did not occur prior to human transport across oceans. Okay, cacti evolved in the Americas. Anacampserotaceae, which is the sister family to Cactaceae, is African. And when you look at Anacampserotaceae, you can see the close resemblance to cacti. But again, it's primarily African. I think there's 1 or 2 species that had actually, there's 2 or 3 species that had a dispersal to Mexico in the last however many millions of years. But for the most part, it's primarily African. Except for Ripsalis bassifera, which was transported probably by a bird to, what is that, Guinea, like equatorial Africa. It's an epiphyte. It's the only cactus species native to Africa. Okay, same thing with Bromeliaceae, except for Pitcairnea feliciana, which is lithophytic, which grows in Guinea. It's the whole family, Bromeliaceae, the pineapple family, the Spanish moss family, is in the Americas. Okay, native distribution of the pine family, same thing, northern hemisphere, except for Pinus mercusii, which grows in the mountains of Sumatra, just makes it over the equator, just barely. Okay, prior to humans, how did species get transported across oceans? Very infrequently. So these dispersal events by birds, basically mimicking what humans have fucked up with the last, 500 years of transoceanic transport of not only animals, but plants as well, the ecosystems that were unprepared for them, evolutionarily speaking. Birds did some of this, but it was very infrequent. And this is another argument that these, invasive species denialists always make. They're like, well, things probably made it there no matter what, It's, well, yeah, they did, but it didn't occur that often. And we can tell that it didn't occur that often by molecular clock dating. Like every few million years, you think about it, it takes a lot, the right set of circumstances for a seed to get established from the plumage of a bird to a new habitat. It's got to be able to thrive in that habitat. Preferably you have more than one seed so that there's significant outcrossing, etc. And either way, there's probably a genetic bottleneck to some extent that prevents it from speciating wildly. The exception to that, of course, would be the Hawaiian silver sword lineage, which had an adaptive radiation when it got to Hawaii. But, so I think about like the Russian thistle here in town that's fucking everywhere. It's like, a lot of these were the result of a single dispersal event or, not many. And so there's not a lot of genetic diversity there, but they're still able to thrive like hell, like these weedy invasive bastards that they are, just because they have no checks and balances. They don't need a lot of genetic diversity because they've got such a leg up in the ecosystem and nothing to keep them in check, right? They got a blank canvas, ecologically speaking. Anyway, debris rafts. Let's talk about the debris rafts too, right? Animals that made it, like the lemurs to Madagascar or the New World monkeys 45 million years ago that made it to, South America from Africa. But remember, that Atlantic Ocean was a lot narrower back then than it is now. So rafting dispersals. Let's hear it for the New World monkeys. Okay, shout out to the New World monkeys that made it on that brave voyage across the Atlantic Ocean 45 million years ago, 40 to 55 million years ago, and got established in the Americas, like the New World monkeys. They're cuter, they're smaller, they're less threatening. They're not going to rip your arms or testicles off like some of the old world monkeys will. Okay, never really met an orangutan. I'm not opposed to it, but I don't have any interest in chimps. Fuck them. Great SciShow episode on the chimp war. It just came out 2 weeks ago. And sometimes plant distributions may be the result of good old plate tectonics or continental drift. Everybody should have a tectonic map, downloaded on their phone. It's the only map that really counts. And so when we look at continental drift, continents coming together, splitting apart again, coming back together. Remember, the Appalachian Mountains exist because of continents coming together 300 million years ago, and then they subsequently spread apart again. So the same rock type in Scotland is what you get in Newfoundland, and parts of Appalachia have similar rocks in Morocco, etc. Right? Well, same thing happened in the southern hemisphere, and that's why certain plant lineages, like this one, the genus Nothofagus, the southern beeches, occur in Chile, and then in Patagonia, and in eastern Australia, and New Zealand and New Guinea. Right? You look at them today. How the fuck did they get there? That's easily 3,000 to 6,000 miles away from each other. Right? But remember, South America and Chile, or South America and Australia, were at one point connected to Antarctica, and before Antarctica froze over, it was a great place to live if you were a plant, as long as you could take those 3 months of complete darkness, which apparently many plants did, because there's an abundance of plant fossils in Antarctica from the Eocene, like Nothofagus, plenty of Nothofagus, plenty of Araucaria. There's Nothofagus gunnii from Tasmania. Look at it, what a nice little plant growing on those rock fields. Those igneous rock fields in Tasmania with eucalyptus and shit ton of cool plants. There's Cyteria gunnii, an apricot-flavored edible fungus that parasitizes, but not detrimentally parasitizes, Nothofagus trees. You get Cyteria anywhere you get Nothofagus, including Chile, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Again, Araucaria, another southern hemisphere Gondwana relict plant family. There was probably some really cool Araucaria growing in Antarctica back in the day. But today they're restricted to 2 species in South America, I think 3 or 4, maybe 3 in Australia, a bunch in these islands. There's some agathis in New Zealand, of course, agathis australis, and a bunch in New Guinea, etc., and up into there's some in Borneo. Is that true? So I guess so. I didn't even know that. Yeah, there's agathis up there. But anyway, but there's tons of Araucaria fossils in Antarctica as well. Really cool fucking trees. Love them. There's a piranha pine, Araucaria angustifolia in Brazil. Proteaceae, same thing. You get a few members just making it into the northern hemisphere, but they're mostly southern hemisphere, and their current distribution is a relict of Gondwana. You can see this common Banksia, which is, or Leucospermum, which is common, or is it Lithospermum? I fucking forget, it's Leucospermum, excuse me. It's Boraginaceae, the other one, which you'll see in bouquets sometimes. Plenty in South Africa, plenty in South America. I saw the genus Rupala in Brazil, plenty in Australia as well. It's just crazy shit. Really cool family of plants, but and plenty of fossils in Antarctica. You can see those anthers that are fused to the tepals, adnate to the tepals right there, and then that pollen presenter, that style, weird plant. But that is a family that's a relict of a Gondwanan distribution, restricted to Southern Hemisphere. Again, this is just elementary biogeography. I think that's it. That's all I got. So anyway, hopefully this got you thinking about some things. And hopefully you have more arguments in your toolbox to argue with some of these people who have not caught on yet to the reality of invasive species and native species and why shit like this matters. So anyway, I got to take a leak. It was a long run, hour and 20 minutes. So hopefully you got some out of that. And if you have any questions, I guess you can email me. Please keep it short or else I won't answer. Have a great day. Go fuck yourself. Bye.